the world was shaken by a stunning declaration made during a global conference. French President Emmanuel Macron revealed that the possibility of deploying Western troops in Ukraine was being considered. This announcement faced swift criticism from both NATO nations and Russia, as Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov emphasized that involving Western troops in Ukraine would not benefit any party involved. Yet Macron has seen the writing on the wall. The situation in Ukraine is precarious, and should Ukraine fall, NATO may not have a choice when it comes to war against Russia. To be fair, Macron was largely speaking of sending non-combatant troops, similar to the known presence of British troops inside of Ukraine, assisting with the logistics of various weapon systems sent there. However, he deliberately maintained an ambiguous stance regarding the deployment of combat troops, or at least made an effort to do so, in order to gain a strategic advantage by sowing uncertainty in Moscow's war strategies concerning the potential confrontation with NATO's formidable military power in Ukraine. However, this plan was swiftly thwarted by the resolute and unanimous opposition of numerous NATO members, unequivocally asserting that such a scenario would never materialize. Macron's previous assertion that NATO was brain dead does hold some validity in light of these events. The fact of the matter is that there is far more at stake than Ukraine, and NATO has been criminally irresponsible in the last 2 years, happily enjoying the peace of its own lands while sending largely symbolic amounts of equipment to stem Russian aggression. Russia's ambitions extend far beyond Ukraine, as shown by a security guarantee offered to the United States in September 2021. In this guarantee, Ukraine is mentioned only twice, while Russia urges for a cessation of any future NATO membership and demilitarization of Central Europe by NATO. The document had some reasonable points, such as each nation no longer staging nuclear weapons outside of their own borders. That's a compromise that heavily favors Russia, but a reasonable request for the sake of the world not turning into a massive fallout LARP. However, the call for NATO to demilitarize Central Europe played right into Russia's hands, serving a clear purpose: to instill fear in the Baltics and Poland. The Baltic states, with a combined population of approximately 6 million, continue to be the most susceptible members of NATO. Their vulnerability is exacerbated by the Suwalki Gap, a narrow passage that poses a significant challenge for reinforcement in the event of a Russian invasion. The gap is the only strip of land that connects the Baltics to Poland, and thus the rest of NATO, and through which NATO forces would have to drive to counterattack a Russian offensive. Yet the gap is surrounded on both sides by Belarus, a Russian proxy state, and Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian enclave. If NATO forces attempted to drive north through the gap, they would be hammered on both sides by air and missile attacks, and the lack of infrastructure makes it impossible to move large amounts of troops quickly, especially if there is a steady stream of refugees trying to flee the fighting. Pushing major NATO combat power as far west as Germany means that the Baltics and Poland would feel even more exposed. Poland likewise is in a poor defensive position, given that it occupies a large swathe of the flat European plain. The vast armored forces of Russia excel in this type of terrain, even though they may lack in technology. The events in Ukraine have demonstrated that having a large quantity of forces can be just as impactful as having superior quality. Moldova, positioned on the western side of Ukraine, is home to the pro-Russian area of Transnistria, where approximately 1,000 to 2,000 Russian troops are currently stationed. It's known that at the start of the Ukraine invasion, Russia hoped to launch a seaborne assault on Odessa along the Ukrainian southern coast, but the operation was halted due to weather and a series of setbacks. Had such an assault succeeded though, Russia would have been able to push west and link up with Transnistria. An assault on Moldova would have been inevitable, all under the guise of liberating Russian speakers. If Russia wins in Ukraine, such an assault is equally inevitable, bringing Russian forces ever closer to the very vulnerable heart of Europe. For too long has the West been blissfully and ignorantly happy to ignore the Russian threat, drunk off the peace dividend that they reaped when the West won history at the end of the Cold War. But Russia never forgot the humiliation and Russian expansion into Europe has always been a matter of national survival. The country is located at the distant edge of the European plain, and its maritime ports can be easily obstructed. Re-establishing the former Soviet bloc provides a safeguard against any potential European aggression, a threat that the nation has endured numerous times in its past, and enhances Russia's capacity to extend its naval influence beyond its own borders. However, despite the skeptics who argue that a victory in Ukraine would mark the conclusion of Russia's expansion, it is highly likely that expansion is an imperative matter for the country's existence. The Russian state is in an inevitable decline. The nation is poorly diversified economically, with over half of its GDP coming from the sale of fossil fuels. Increasingly, it's not even able to sell more lucrative refined products due to technological bans from the West. Instead, it has to export low-profit crude oil that other nations like India and China then refine and resell for a substantial profit, combined with a price cap imposed by the European Union and its two major customers, China and India. Exploiting its weakened position to negotiate heavy discounts, the Russian economy is inevitably going to shrink. Currently, the nation is relying on its substantial reserves of approximately $312 billion, which were available at the beginning of the Ukraine war. However, $300 billion of this total amount is currently frozen in Western banks. Eventually, these reserves will deplete, and experts like Jeffrey Sonnenfeld from Yale suggest that Russia may have around 1.5 to 2 years remaining before facing financial challenges. But it doesn't matter anyway, because the world is transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, an inevitable process that isn't just necessary to stabilize our climate, but one that is a top national defense priority for many nations. The massive leverage Russia was able to exert on Europe at the start of the Ukraine war, due to their reliance on Russian oil, was a warning sign to the world. If you don't want to be held hostage by foreign powers, who either provide your energy or can interdict your energy shipments, you need to produce it domestically and renewably. In the upcoming 50 years, Russia could potentially witness a staggering decline of more than 50% in its GDP. The country's struggle to foster technological innovation due to inadequate investments and the continuous departure of young talents has resulted in Russia lagging behind in the realm of information, which is a vital component of a thriving and contemporary economy. Russia's Yandex, which was Google's largest competition in the region, was recently acquired by state-backed groups at a significantly discounted price, evidence that the entire endeavor is unraveling. Originally, Putin had wanted to nationalize Yandex so as to exert greater control over the information space, but was warned that its technical specialists would all quit in protest. The Russian Far East is a treasure trove of energy resources that China has been eagerly coveting for the past 20 years. The local Russian population is dwindling as more and more Russians migrate towards the west, particularly to the Moscow region, while Chinese immigrants are steadily taking their place. Chinese investments in the region now significantly outweigh Russian investments, and Chinese culture has begun to displace Russian culture, with the Chinese Official Maps Agency last year revealing new maps naming Chinese territory seized by the Russian Empire in the 17th through 19th century in their native Chinese names. The intention is clear. China wants a big bite out of Russia, and Russia may not be able to prevent it. Russia's future as a second-tier economy and major player on the world stage appears to be set in stone. But looking back at the past, it's clear that expanding its territory could be the solution to averting this decline. Seizing control of nations such as Ukraine, the Baltics, or Poland, each with robust and varied economies, might just be the ticket for Russia to breathe new life into its empire and maintain its significance in the international sphere. Russia has every incentive to win in Ukraine and keep going, even if Europe is still too irresponsibly asleep at the wheel to acknowledge it. Is this realistic though? Does Putin honestly think he can continue his campaign? But one need only look at the current state of affairs both at home and abroad in Russia. The nation has begun to mobilize its industry for war rate production. In October 2023, Putin established a fresh military council tasked with supervising domestic industry. This council was granted the authority to guide certain industries and potentially assume control over their finances, allowing for a more hands-on managerial approach. While defense industry workers were already moved to round-the-clock shifts back in summer, new legislation also allowed for employees to have vacations cancelled or overtime enforced on them. The State Duma also announced legislation allowing the government to seize the assets of any company ending its Russian operations. While this will have a significant effect on discouraging investment into Russia, both now and in the future, should sanctions be dropped, the fact that Russia is willing to cut itself off from international financing is a very troubling sign that Russia has charted a course for its own future, one that does not include Western businesses reintroducing themselves into Russia. And this prepares the nation for a larger scale war against NATO. To make matters worse, Russia has taken the measure of NATO and found it severely lacking. Even though the economies and military might of NATO far surpass Russia's, the alliance has been unable to effectively counter Russian aggression in Ukraine for the past 2 years. Instead of confronting Putin's blatant hostilities, NATO leaders have been tiptoeing around the issue, hesitating to provide the much-needed military assistance that Ukraine urgently requires. Only nations like Poland, directly on the firing line of a future war with Russia, have taken the situation seriously enough to send significant amounts of aid. What aid has been provided has been piecemeal, always negotiated down from what was originally proposed out of fear of provoking Russia, and delivered in unpredictable spurts that leave Ukraine unable to coordinate its military campaign. If Ukraine doesn't know when the next aid shipment will come and what will come with it, it simply can't afford to wage decisive campaigns and risk losing equipment that might not be replaced. NATO's flaccid response to Russian aggression has proven to Putin that he can indeed intimidate the militarily superior alliance, but it has also exposed a significant weakness that 30 years of dominating low-intensity conflict in Africa and the Middle East had hidden. NATO's defense industry is abysmal. The alliance routinely produces true world-beating weapons. Russian engineers would kill their own babushkas for access to Storm Shadow, the F-35, or German diesel-electric submarines. But Western defense industries are basically artisanal compared to the Russian megalith. Russia's equipment production may seem outdated compared to NATO's reverse-engineered UFO technology from the 1980s, but the real issue arises when NATO stocks deplete quickly during conflicts. This becomes evident when they struggle to send tanks to Ukraine and maintain a steady supply due to slow production rates. On the other hand, Russian industry manages to produce around 400 new tanks annually, along with refurbishing from their reserves. The US, meanwhile, produces just 120 Abrams a year, and the vaunted Leopard is truly an endangered species, with an estimated 50 or so tanks produced a year and 60 to 70 modernized a year. The situation for Germany is so bad that it will take years for the nation to modernize and fully equip its own armor forces at this rate. With the mobilization of its industry, Russia is set to dramatically expand tank production and refurbishment. In the meantime, the Western world is skillfully crafting weapons at an artisanal level, where every single nut and bolt is meticulously handcrafted by master artisans residing in serene mountaintop retreats. These skilled craftsmen only embark on their creations when the muses of inspiration strike them, resulting in truly exceptional weaponry. Russia, meanwhile, is pumping out tanks that may be inferior, but in enough numbers to achieve Russia's preferred strategy of victory by means of literally absorbing every bullet and anti-tank missile you have until you're out of ammo. The nation has an incredible tolerance for pain, taking nearly 100,000 estimated KIA in 2 years of fighting, more than the US suffered in 20 years of fighting in Vietnam. Europe is gradually realizing that a Russian triumph in Ukraine would lead to Russia possessing the biggest and most skilled land army in Europe, capable of utilizing more Ukrainian manpower, along with an industry and society that are fully prepared for war. Despite 20 months ago, France's Macron stating that Russia must not be, quote, humiliated. Today, he is singing a different tune and attempting to compel the rest of Europe to wake up and act before it's too late. His fears are well-founded too, with Ukrainian setbacks across the front with Russia. The setbacks that have occurred can be attributed to two main factors: Europe's failure to adequately support Ukraine and the delay in American aid to the nation. Shell shortage directly led to the fall of Avdiivka and further reversals. And today, Ukrainian forces are once more having to carefully ration their ammunition. Meanwhile, Russia has imported millions of rounds from abroad and has significantly stepped up domestic production. Europe, on the other hand, failed to meet more than 50% of the million rounds promised in 2023. Though Macron has led the effort in the EU overturning a ban on buying foreign shells, and the EU is now looking to purchase supplies from Europe. The West's self-centered, narrow-minded, and reckless approach is vividly illustrated by this hollow legislation, which insisted on sourcing shells exclusively from within the EU. While Ukraine fights for its very existence and battles a war that will shape Europe's future, the EU seems more focused on strengthening its own economy. Europe has prioritized its own economic well-being for decades, and Putin's charges that Europeans were weak and unable to tolerate pain have proven true. Meanwhile, the United States helped ensure Ukraine's current failures. MAGA sympathizers within the American Congress have continued to hamstring legislation that would provide war-winning levels of military support for Ukraine. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson has repeatedly refused to put a bill that would provide both funding for Ukraine and for border security to a vote. And the wide consensus, even amongst other Republicans increasingly frustrated with MAGA, is that he is only doing so to give federal criminal defendant Donald Trump ammunition for his presidential campaign. The Trump campaign is determined to capitalize on the southern border crisis to gain political advantage, and they are actively undermining any attempts to find a solution for this pressing issue. Unfortunately, Ukraine aid is tied up with a bill that other Republicans have agreed to already, which is why Johnson refuses to put it up for a vote. Trump's comments that he would allow and even encourage Russia to attack NATO members who did not meet 2% funding goals is also more troubling evidence that Johnson's tampering with Ukraine aid may be about more than just providing fuel for the Trump campaign. The end result is that Putin is now more confident that, given a Republican win in the 2024 election, he may be granted the leverage to continue his war past Ukraine, even into NATO himself. Trump has repeatedly stated sentiments to the effect that he would pull the US out of the alliance, and there are few who believe a Trump presidency would be willing to fulfill NATO Article 5 commitments over a Russian attack in the Baltics or Poland. The unsettling truth that the United States, a key member of NATO, can no longer be counted on as a dependable ally has reverberated globally. This has not only weakened American influence in Europe, but also raised doubts among Pacific allies like Japan, South Korea, and Australia about the US commitment to safeguarding against Chinese threats. This development has prompted certain individuals in Europe to view the Russia situation with greater gravity, leading Macron to consider the possibility of European powers having to confront Russia in Ukraine or potentially on their own territories. The era of reaping the benefits of peace after the Cold War has come to a close. It is now the responsibility of the Western nations to determine which battle to engage in: the ongoing conflict in Ukraine or a potential future clash in the heart of Europe against a formidable Russia.